Okay, so yeah, let's get back to it. Let's get talking about variables. So, what is a variable? Variables are essentially the way we tell our program to remember data. Now, just a couple notes. This is not the same as storing data. And what I mean by storing data, think about storage of what gets saved even when your power goes out. So when you turn off your computer and you turn stuff on, stuff is remembered, your data is stored to your hard drive. Variables are going to be remembered and when the program is running. They're going to be stored or remembered to your RAM. And so those variables are only going to be stored or remembered during the life cycle of your app. So we're not going to store anything to the hard drive. This is all just being remembered in memory. So variable has four main parts. Right here, here's an example. Favorite food equals tacos. So the parts of a variable is it has a name. In this case, that would be favorite food. It has a value. The value is tacos. This value, as we learned about last video, has a type. This type would be a string. And then we're also going to talk about something that variables have this scope, or i.e. this concept of visibility, which we'll kind of see a little bit in the demo. And just to kind of look at maybe what's going behind the scenes of variables is you give the variable a name. And what really that is, that's just an identifier that's going to reference an address in your computer's memory. And then that's going to store the value. A little more detailed diagram down here. And this is just more for just, FYI and just kind of fun. So, we might name a variable sum and then we give it a type. Now, depending on the type, this is going to determine how much memory we need to reserve. And this is why we have different types of numbers. So these are examples of some different kind of numbers. See, a double uses a lot more memory than an int. So this is why the data types that we talked about last time is really important at a hard code level, is because your computer needs to save the memory or the reserve memory for certain types of data. But you don't need to remember that. That's just kind of a side note. Okay, so let's go look at variables. So variables have a name. Now, you choose this as the programmer. Languages don't care what you call variables. I mean, there's a little asterisk here. Languages do have rules, naming rules that you have to follow, but generally, you really can call them whatever you want. And the computer doesn't care. But the humans do. So the takeaway from here is choose descriptive, meaningful variable names. We're going to look at this in the next slide, but just for example, let's look at variable names in Ruby. These can be created from alphanumeric characters and the underscore character. A variable cannot begin with a number. And also variables cannot begin with a capital letter. Well, they can, but those are going to be reserved for constants, which we'll also talk about. Okay, so let's kind of look at this. This is where variable names are, if you're not descriptive, this is bad. So we have x equals 38 and y equals 22. So and these are valid variable names. Ruby's not going to complain. But later in our code, we're going to maybe see them being used. If x is greater than y, now this is going to be hard to read. Like, what is x here and what is y? It's not going to be easy to tell. And let me show you a better example of naming variables. So here I'm naming my variable John age. And here I'm naming this variable legal drinking age. And then I'm assigning them the values. But this way, with a good variable name, when I'm reading this later in my code, now this is, I can almost read this in English. If John age is greater than legal drinking age, I can understand what's going on here. I might not know the values of these, but I know what they're kind of representing. So this is kind of bringing up this concept we're going to be talking about, readability, your code readability. So great code is more than it just works. It needs to be readable by you and other devs. And this is things like following things like consistently indenting and formatting your code. Variables and functions are named meaningfully. And then also follow language conventions. We're going to see an example where Ruby uses snake cases for variable names. There's a lot more rules, but these are kind of some of the ones as you're starting out to think about. Like really focus on indenting your code properly and naming functions and variables good, and trying to learn and follow the conventions of languages. Okay, so back to variables. Variables have a value. Or it really can just be stated that variables or a variable is just a named value. For example, here I'm saying John age is 28. John age is 28. This is just a name for this value. Likewise, I could say John name equals the string John. John name is the string John. And so forth with this example down here. And just as we saw, every value is going to have a type. So if I say John equals 20 age, John age, the type of this variable is an integer. If I set it equal to a string, then the type of the variable is going to be a string. So don't overthink this. I'm just naming this variable and I'm assigning it a value. So it's almost like it's an alias for this data. Variables have scope or visibility. Now, different languages have different rules for this, but they all have the concept of scope. And some examples with the Ruby is if we start a variable with a $sign and then give it a name, this is what's referred to as global scope, and this variable is going to be visible throughout your application. And we're going to see as a general rule, we don't ever want to really use environment variables. Especially when you're starting out, we're going to avoid these. There's instance variables, and these start with the @ symbol. So if I say @colors and give this, whatever value, this is in an array in this case, these are going to be scoped to the file. So they're going to be visible everywhere in the file. And then all other variables are going to have local scope. And we'll kind of see an example where the difference between something with local scope and an instance variable are different. So there's another flavor of variables, and these are called constants. And these are variables whose values don't change. So think about the number pi or e, or maybe you have like a standard color throughout your app. Anytime you want to use a variable just to have it hold a value, but you know that value is never going to change, we can put that in a constant. And in Ruby, constants are defined by starting a variable with a caps lock. So since the first letter is a caps lock, that's going to be a constant. Okay, so let's just step right into a demo for this. Give me 1 second. Where is my code? Oh yeah, I wanted to demo. So I've been using VS Code, but I also wanted to demo if you're having troubles getting VS Code running, this repelit.com. This is just a nice little online IDE where I can start typing in Ruby. So I'm just going to create a REPEL. Notice I selected this Ruby language. I can come in here, languages, search for Ruby. Maybe you're having trouble with setup, maybe you weren't able to get it running. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. And then I can go ahead and name it like variable demo. Read that. So now here I have a place where I can, let me make this bigger so it's easy for you to read. I have a place where I can type some code and then I can run it and then see it, just like I would in the terminal. So I could say like puts hello, and then I can run that. Now I think VS Code and the integrated terminal is going to be better. It's a little faster, but if you can't get that set up or you don't have the same setup, this is going to work for everyone because this is just on the worldwide internet. So let's go ahead and get into the little demo. So let's say I have this variable called language, and I'm just going to try to puts this out. Okay, so I get an error because by default, Ruby doesn't know about this language thing that I just created. It's saying, hey, this is an undefined local variable or method. And Ruby's yelling at me because I haven't defined it. So what I need to do is, before I use it, I need to define it. And I'm just going to create my variable. So my variable has the name language, and I'm setting it equal to the string Ruby. And now I can try to put this out to the console. And there we go, Ruby. And then I could also do ruby.class. So our variables have a type, and that's a string. You can just even see, does my language, so I can see if things equal each other with the double or triple equals. I can say, does my language, does it equal the string Ruby? And that's true. So language and the string Ruby are the exact same thing. This is just a name for that string. Something else I can do is I can reassign this variable. So I've already assigned it, but now maybe I want to change it. So then I could say, hey, language equals Ruby with an uppercase. And run that. And now I've changed my variable. Cool. Let's go ahead and close that out. So let's look at some other examples. Let's say I have a variable called count, and that's equal to 1. And then I have a variable it's called step, and I'm going to set that equal to 5. I can come in here and I can say, do a little math with my variables. I can say count equals count plus step. Now really, when I'm thinking about these variables, count and step, they're really just the values here. So count is 5 and step is 1. So this is 6. So I'm going to set count equal to 6 here. And if I did this again, now in this line, count would be 6 because I've changed it right here. And then step would still be 5. So 6 plus 5 is 11. And then I'm going to reassign count right here to be 11. I could just keep on doing this. So now count is 11, step is still 5, so 11 plus 5 is 16, and then we reassign that to count. So that should be 16. Let's go ahead and check right here and just puts count. There we go, 16. So I'm just trying to show that the variables, they're just named, they're just a name for our data. And then we can use them throughout our app and we can remember these values. Remember we talked about constants. So I'm going to say pi equals 3.14. And now I'm going to try to change pi. Now this works, but I get a warning saying that, hey, you've already initialized a constant pi. So why would you want to redefine it? So I would either need to say, oh wait, this shouldn't be a constant and make that a lowercase, or I should just get rid of this one. To get rid of that warning. Okay. So let's talk about scope as well. So I'm going to create some variables, local var. I'm just going to say this is a local variable. I'm going to do my instance variable with the @ symbol, instance var. This is a instance variable. And then let's do our global variable. Global. Do not use, please. So then we have our 3 variables. Now we haven't talked about functions yet, but I'm going to define a function. Let's call this scope test. So here's how I define a function in Ruby, and this is how I call a function in Ruby. Pretty simple. And let's just test this out. So I'm going to do a puts scope test called. All right. And then we define the function and then we call it. So there's a little intro into functions. So we've called the function here. All right. So let's now try to put out our variables. I'm going to start here. I'm just going to start with our global variable, our global var, and puts our instance var. We can run this, and those work. Nothing's breaking here. But now I'm going to go ahead and put this local var within this function. And I've spelled it right. Those have the same spelling. I'm going to run this. Now I get an error. Local variable or method is not defined. So this is a scoping thing. So what this is saying is, hey, since I declared this as a local variable without a @ or a $sign, this local variable is not going to be scoped inside this function. So this is going to cause an error. Now we don't have to get too much into scoping, just kind of want to show you that these variables are going to be scoped differently. But I can use this local var, I can put it out right here. It's not inside the function, but it's still within the file. And that works. Now, what we can do with this, I can create a variable called local var in here. I think this is something that's a little confusing when you're first starting out, so I kind of want to just give you your first taste of this. A lot of times we can have variables that have the same name, but since they're scoped differently, they're not the same variable. So here I could declare another variable called local variable, but this is just going to be scoped inside the function. So if I run this, it's going to say log this var in function right here. And this, see how this one is not changing the value of this because at the very end we're putting our local var. This is a local var. So there's just your first taste of this. We'll talk more about this when we get a little further into functions, but I think this is a good little first demo of that. All right. And yeah, just one last thing. So this is about readability. So if you noticed, I've been using what's called snake case when I'm naming my variables. So what snake case is, if I have a word, since my variable name has to be connected, if I have a variable name that I come up with and it has more than a couple words, with each word I'm going to use a underscore. That is a snake case variable. I could do camel case. Camel case is where I use a caps lock for each new word. Now both of these are valid Ruby names. These both don't break any rules with the Ruby language. So they're going to work. Just to show you this. But it's a Ruby convention to use snake case. And we're going to see in JavaScript, although in JavaScript they both work, it's kind of a convention in JavaScript to use camel case. Although JavaScript is a little more loose with that rule. Ruby, you're definitely going to see snake case through the majority of it. So that's just our quick little introduction into variables. We'll definitely get a lot more practice with these as we go on. But now we've talked about data in our first video, and now we've also talked about variables and how to store that data. So next we're going to kind of talk about conditionals and how we can use logic to do things if a condition is true or not. And yeah, so that is it for this lecture.